Jesus' name, let the church arise to shine your light to the world. Shine your light.
All right, let's go into our clergy cliff notes. Let's start with Delmar. Delmar, you have I don't know if it's gonna be a fun light one or if it's gonna be serious, but you have a good one. I want to hear what your clergy cliff note is.
Okay, premarital counseling. All right, have you guys all done this?
Yes.
This is one of the jewels in ministry, I think.
It really is.
Times. I absolutely love it. And the way ours is at church is I think I've got it down in like 5 sessions, and one deals with like the heart, and then one deals with like your mind, and then your family, and then your soul. And then at the end, we kind of put it all together. Anyways, I'm telling you all that to say I was getting into session 2 this past week with a couple, because I got a couple of marriage counseling things going on. And session 2 begins off where session 1 kind of ends, where it's like the reason you come to me and not the court is because I care. That's the difference. When you have a pastor doing your wedding, like I care. At the courthouse, they don't care. And I talk about how honesty is so important. So session 2 starts off heavy. Okay. Now it goes light because we get into the vows, and the vows is probably my favorite thing to talk about. But session 2 starts off like this. Hey, remember, we're building a relationship of trust between you and us. And then when they say yes, I look at them and I say, okay, so are you having sex? I just cold turkey, like cold turkey. There's no really easy way to walk into that. And then if they are, I walk into that. There's some things I say, and then we'll eventually, even they sign a covenant to abstain, and we kind of walk through that together. So here I am. I'm a little nervous because I'm about to get up in their business, and I rolled out the whole spiel, and I'm like, okay, the next line is, so are you having sex? So I say, it's about trust. And then they go, well, actually, Pastor, we need to tell you something. And I'm like, oh, they're just going to go ahead and confess. Oh, thank you, God. They're going to go ahead and confess it so I don't have to go there, right? And she looks at me. She goes, yeah, we're already married. They went off and got married, went out.
Between the first and second session?
You just eloped?
They thought that I knew. Right? They're like, yeah, we thought you were kind of in, so maybe you had known already. We know we didn't tell you, but we figured we couldn't start this session off without telling you that we're already married. So like beside the question on my seat says, are you having sex? I was like, yup. and now like, so we're going to be doing a wedding, and I'm like, the people don't know. And I'm like, so how do we do? So now I'm walking through, how do we do that and be ethical, because this is a big day. And I just think like what I'm learning is every time I do marriage counseling, even though I have kind of like a guideline and I think I have some useful tools, it's so unique and is so specific toward each couple. And like on the low hanging fruit, I would just wanted to ask you guys, like, how do y'all step into marriage counseling? Like, is there, like before you even start the series, do y'all have any things in place that kind of guide you for this massive day in people's lives? And then when a ball comes out of left field, like how do y'all feel that?
I know Doug Fields has a book. What's the name of it, Tim? Do you remember? Or does anybody know the name of it?
Getting Ready for Marriage.
Getting Ready for Marriage. Yeah, it also has a workbook for couples. So I that's the curriculum that I use. They purchase that, they start that, and get ready for session.
And
1.
then there's a follow-up that Delmar should use with his couples called The First Few Years of Marriage.
Yep.
That for when you're already married and
Surprise.
There you go. I should
Yeah.
put that in my notes.
Yeah. So I've been using that as somewhat of an outline, but even before that, I try to tell the couple like, hey, if we're gonna do this, like I'm gonna ask hard questions, and it might get uncomfortable because I'm gonna be so forthright that no one's probably ever asked you questions like this before, and then I'm also gonna challenge you to think things that maybe are difficult. Especially if it's premarital counseling, like I also sometimes tell them I might ask you questions that may feel like me telling you that you shouldn't get married, or I'm trying to poke and prod to like cause you to reconsider this, but that's not what I'm trying to do. It's simply for the sake of making sure we are talking about everything you can think about before you get married. And I think like if that conversation is wide open and like those gates are open, then like I have no problem saying like, hey, like what boundaries are you setting up right now in your dating and engagement relationship? What are you doing right now to set up a success for your marriage? Like, let's talk about pornography, and let's talk about like the stuff that no one is really comfortable talking about in the social settings, because if I don't, and I'm the one overseeing the officiating the covenant of your marriage, then like then no one else will, right? So I mean, I'm sure you guys have other things, but the biggest I think you should do is like just set the precedence that like I'm going to ask very uncomfortable questions that like don't sound romantic. That are going to be maybe kind of pragmatic. Like, hey, have you really talked about how many kids you want? Because if you don't have this conversation now, it's going to be really awkward and maybe even cause bitterness down the line because one person wants 2 kids, the other person wants 5 kids. And what if you can't have any kids? Like these are conversations that you need to have now because otherwise it's going to get worse after you get married. So I think setting that precedent early is probably to me the most important thing I think of when I'm doing it. Otherwise, those books are great because they ask great questions too.
I let the tough questions be asked by the books because it's just easier to have the book ask the hard questions than have me be the one making things awkward. But the first thing that I do when I meet with a couple is I say, I'm thrilled to meet with you, but there's something you need to understand is that I'm not a licensed counselor. I've got a good 2, 3, 4 premarital counseling sessions in me. But if there's an issue that needs actual counseling, I'm not your guy. I've got a list. Here's who you want to talk to about that. And if you want me to marry you, and so you want me to do the premarital counseling because I'm the one marrying you, my feelings won't be hurt if you go with somebody else. Like I'm your pastor, you want me to do your wedding. That's fine if you go to somebody else for premarital counseling, because going to an actual trained counselor instead of, hey, this guy's been married for a bunch of years and has some kids, he might have some wisdom, is not always the best route, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's good. Don't pretend to be a licensed counselor if you are not in fact,
any situation
a licensed counselor.
Know
Right?
where your boundary is.
Yeah.
Like if they do need to go, you need to be able to know, recommend. I keep cards on hand, people
That's
I
good.
could recommend.
Yep.
And at the same time, like when you really get into it, I think a lot of what I do as a pastor is, I know some wisdom I've learned, just being married myself. But ultimately I want to show them this is what happens to your marriage when the gospel interacts with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like this is how it really should. I know for me, I think every pastor's got their own unique things. And one of the unique things I do is I use some first century vows with mine. And I tell them, I was like, if you're buying your house, do you want to write up your own contract? Or do you want a contract that like 20 lawyers have used before and like that you're not going to get like messed over in the deal, So a lot of times at that point, they're like, yeah, we'll love to check those vows out. And basically we spend a whole session going through those and talking about like, this is what it means to be in a covenant relationship with you. And I'm not, it's hairy because like one time we were going through it and I found out in these vows that the guy wasn't a believer. Like he was kind of rolling along with it. But when we found out, and then I'm sitting here and I'm like, when you're in the middle of it, this is a tense situation. I'm like, God, help me. I don't even know what to say. I don't want to like make these people angry, but at the same time, I want to be loving, and I just told him, I went through her vows first and I said, how much of this are you on board with? She's like 100%. I'm like, that's awesome. And then when I went through his, he was like, I'm like 80% there. And I was like, so here's the conversation you have to have. And we kind of had to end the session because they needed to go talk. I was like, you have to realize that when he's in front of you, in front of all your loved ones, he only means 80% of what's coming out of his mouth. Like, and before you marry him, you have to be okay with him not fully meaning every word. And like, to me, that goes back to what Frank was saying. Like, that sucked to say. Like no one, I did not want to leave the session that way, but I feel the weight of that. I mean, how do y'all deal with like the weight? Ultimately, it's them, it's their decision. And here's kind of what my pastors who mentor me have said. Listen, if you just shut it down right there and say, I will not do your wedding, guess what? They then are going to go to the courthouse or somewhere else. And then you lose the ability to follow up with them and to love them well. So if y'all had to make any tough calls like that,
I've broken a couple up. That was exciting.
Ooh, how'd you do that?
The Doug Fields and Jim Burns book, the Getting Ready for Marriage, I gave it to a couple, and she read it and was waiting for him to read it so they could then discuss it together. And after 3 weeks, he hadn't read it yet. And she said there were so many red flags that I highlighted in the book. And then the fact that he wouldn't read the book, I just knew that this wouldn't be done.
Wow.
So she's still an active part of our church and is dating somebody else. He's married to somebody else with a kid, and I haven't been at this church for that long. And
so
if you're a
kidding
hockey
about
fan, that's like taking a minus on the ice. That's like that's a -1. Yeah.
But at the same, going back to what you were saying about going to the courthouse, the first senior pastor that I ever worked for told me one time, he said, Andrew, you're not going to lead anybody to Christ by telling them that they're not good enough for you to marry. And so just about anybody that comes to me that says, hey, we want you to marry us. And if you meet this, and this, I'm going to marry you. So I've done some weird weddings. I did a wedding on a Ferris wheel once. I did a wedding where the bride walked down a runner of bubble wrap because she wanted to feel happy. And what makes you happier than stepping on bubble wrap? Just weird stuff under the idea of this is a discipleship and a disciple making opportunity. And that's
the most millennial thing I've ever heard of. I need to feel happy while I'm going to marry somebody.
She also had everyone handed a kazoo when they walked in so that they could play Here Comes the Bride on the kazoo.
Okay.
It was a weird wedding. But
wow.
But the idea is that I've completely lost it at this point. But in Florida, especially, a notary public can marry somebody in Florida. We're one of the few states where that can happen. So if you can't get married at the church and you don't want to go to the courthouse, you can go to the post office in Florida and get married.
Yep.
So by me accepting someone's invitation to speak into their relationship and into their marriage, I get to present the gospel. And that means that there are going to be people that are on different wavelengths at time, but telling someone that they're not good enough for you to marry them, or telling them they're not ready, but they perceive it as you saying you're not good enough for us to marry you. All that does is that means they're going to go to anybody else, because in Florida, it takes a monkey to marry somebody. I mean, anybody can do it. So I take it as a huge privilege and responsibility, but I also know that privilege and that responsibility is on me,
that's a good way of
not necessarily on them.
I'll hop in as well. And so it's a little different in Maryland. You do have to be, I'm pretty sure you have to be clergy. So it's slightly different, but I basically, so for someone to have their wedding in our building, I have to do premarital counseling with you and do the wedding. And for me, I will marry 2 believers. I will marry 2 unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, I will at least have multiple conversations with a couple who's one is an unbeliever and one's a believer. But that helps to hopefully avoid what you described, Del, where you're like already into the process and then you discover somebody's not a believer. So those are the hard questions I ask in the first setting. I go straight to the spiritual stuff first and ask those questions about, are you both, explain the gospel to me and that kind of stuff. And so when I was the first couples that I helped with premarital, I used Timothy Keller's book, Meaning of Marriage. And it has, I think there's some study guides and stuff. When I first used it, I just read the book with the couple and came up with questions to talk about. But now I use Symbis, which is Save Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's an assessment tool that you can get registered with. You have to go through a little training online. It's put out by Les and Leslie Parrott. So pretty big names in the counseling world. And it's a really great tool. I would definitely recommend it. It costs a little bit of money, but I think it's totally worth it. It also puts you in a database where people, if they're looking for it, can find your name, if you're like in their area, and you can do that. So what it does is you have a meeting with them, you kind of explain it, and then they each take an assessment that goes through all of those questions that we've talked about, and it spits out a report to me. It's very similar to Prepare and Rich in that regard. So I get a report, and then basically I just go through that report over the course of, however long it is until the wedding day. And so you ask all those kind of questions. I mean, it gets into the nitty gritty of like who's going to take the trash out, who's going to do the dishes, and, all the way to the big things like who's going to earn the money and who's going to do the housework and, all the things that you guys that, we're all married and we know those are what start arguments. I do try to emphasize really hard. This is a covenant, not a contract. And I really try to, in my first couple meetings with them, talk about the difference of that. And then, we do the Symbis thing, Save Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's just symbis.com, symbis.com. You can go there and find that info.
How about this, guys?
Found it super helpful.
This is what I would love. Can you guys each email me what you use? And then I will put it with what I have, and I can make that as a free resource for literally everyone in our Facebook group.
Sure.
So is now the time to tell you that I use a free Enneagram test to be like, hey, people, just know your basic personality.
It's good to know. Yeah.
I use an animal personality test. Have you heard of lion, otter, beaver, golden retriever?
I don't know if there's a punchline coming or not.
No, there's no punchline.
I am so excited right now that you said all that.
We should take that on here.
That would be hilarious.
It is amazing. I'll send it to you guys. And
honestly, I'll take this. Retriever.
Yes, I will put that test in our free resources. And here's a cool thing. If you're a pastor listening, this is a great test to use with your own deacon board, with your elders, with your staff. It's a 5-minute way to feel out how each other act by default. It's very cool.
Yes.
So I use that in
SDI
marriage.
is another good tool like that. I would say one funny anecdote about premarital counseling and cultural awareness. I have done 2 weddings for Burmese couples who are part of the community here. And I found out at the wedding ceremony of the first that they do not like to show affection in public. So when I said you may kiss the bride, it was unbelievably awkward because
so what were you supposed to do?
They don't do that in their weddings. So
you stare at each other intimately.
Well, you don't say you may kiss the bride. You just announce that they're married. So I'm just saying, if you're a pastor in a diverse place and you end up with a couple who's from a different culture, be sensitive to it because
that's a good word.
It puts you and them in a really awkward spot otherwise.
I've got an awkward spot for you. Oh, I did a wedding maybe a year ago. And after the wedding, I said to the couple, hey, do you have your marriage license for me to sign? And they said, no, we didn't actually get a marriage license.
Mm-hmm.
This was just like for our friends and family because we wanted to be married in God's eyes, not the government's. What that translated to was she still had a hefty alimony check that she was receiving. And
the problem is not the problem.
So the whole thing of telling someone that they're not good enough for you to marry, it does have its backfires sometimes.
What did you do, man?
What could I do?
It was done.
It was done. They didn't have nowhere in any wedding I've ever done do I call them 3 days before, like, hey, just calling to make sure you applied for your marriage license.
That's
because
fair. Yeah.
Did you go back up on the platform and yell, I declare this marriage rescinded?
I'm going to put that in here in our notes for the pastors. Ask them, make sure they're getting a marriage license.
Make sure it will be legal in whatever. But I did another wedding where the couple, he was from India and she was from the States. And so they had their legal wedding in India, but they were doing like a Florida wedding for the Florida family that couldn't go to India. It's kind of like the Jonas Brother wedding thing where they had 8 of them. But so this was a wedding where like, oh, there's no marriage license because they got married in another country. But this was completely different. This was no. We want all the perks of being married, but we still want the ex-husband to pay for everything.
Wow.
So don't do that.
I do think there's an interesting long conversation at some point about how we have mixed government with
absolutely.
That, like in marriage, it really comes out. We say that this is an institution that God created, and yet we all only view people as married when the state says they're married.
Yep.
Right.
Separation of church and state, except for on the wedding day or when the state needs a place to vote. Yep. Other than that, separation of church and state.
And really, the only reason states care about marriage is because it creates citizens that you can tax.
Right.
Yep.
Real talk.
Guys, this has been great. All these resources will be in the show notes, as well as Delmar is probably going to put them in the Facebook group.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound right? Yeah. Yes. I'm also going to throw in there one thing when I started doing my own, when I started officiating weddings, is I wanted a template of like the service, because sometimes a lot of weddings, they might have a wedding planner, but sometimes they're like, we just want to get married. How can you help us? And so by de facto, the pastor becomes the wedding planner in some fashion, at least the service part. And so I have like an outline that I use, and I actually have words that like, I don't care if people, steal from me.
Hey, that book I recommended a few weeks back, the pastor's book or any pastor's manual should have those in there as well.
All Let the law